The trauma bay doors exploded open at 2:47 in the morning, and four armed soldiers in full combat gear carried a dying man through Harlow Peak Medical Center like they owned the building. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The lead soldier scanned every face in the room, the doctors, the charge nurses, the residents frozen against the wall. And when he spoke, his voice cut through everything. "We need Nurse Phantom. Right now. Where is she?" Silence. Then, from behind a supply cart in the corner, a woman in plain scrubs set down a box of gloves and quietly raised her hand. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel and follow along to the very end, because the twists in this one don't stop. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. The supply closet on the east wing of Harlow Peak Medical Center smelled like latex and floor cleaner, and Mara Sutton had memorized every shelf in it. Gauze pads on the left, second row from the top, saline flushes behind the trauma kits, laryngoscope blades in the cabinet with the sticky door that needed a shoulder to open it. Mara had reorganized that closet 4 times since she started at Harlow Peak, not because anyone asked her to, but because when a trauma rolled in and a nurse couldn't find a 10-blade in under 6 seconds, patients paid the price. Nobody thanked her for it. Most of the ER staff didn't even know her name. She was the supply nurse, the one who refilled the carts, counted the crash kit inventory at the start of every shift, and stayed out of the way. That was the expectation. That was the role. And Mara had learned, over 7 months at this hospital, that expectations at Harlow Peak were enforced like policy. She was pushing her cart past Trauma 3 at 9:30 on a Tuesday when she heard the argument start. "I don't care what the chart says, Marcus. You're not listening to me." The voice belonged to Dr. Sandra Ewan, the kind of trauma attending who conducted hallway conversations at a volume that made residents flinch. She was tall, sharp-jawed, and had a habit of wearing her lanyard over her left shoulder like a badge of distinction. In her world, she was always right. The chart was sometimes wrong. The other voice, quieter, steadier, was Dr. Randall Osei, a second-year emergency medicine resident who had made the mistake of disagreeing with her on a patient's fluid protocol. The literature on crystalloid resuscitation in blunt abdominal trauma. I know what the literature says. I trained at Mercy General for 12 years. Don't quote literature at me. Mara slowed her cart. Not because she wanted to eavesdrop, but because Trauma 3's supply rack needed restocking, and she couldn't do her job without passing them. She caught the name on the whiteboard as she turned the corner. Patient in Bay 3. Male, 40s, suspected splenic laceration following MVA. 2 units of packed red cells already in. Systolic pressure holding at 91. Mara ran that in her head without meaning to. It just happened. Her mind pulling the information apart the way it always did, the way it had been trained to do in conditions that no one at Harlow Peak knew anything about. She didn't say a word. She restocked the rack, clicked the cart into the hallway, and kept moving. That was the job. Eyes forward, don't interfere. Her shift ended at 11, but she stayed until 11:45 helping the overnight crew sort a delivery that had come in mislabeled. 3 boxes of 22-gauge catheters marked as 18-gauge, which would have been a quiet disaster for whoever tried to run blood products through them. She caught it because she always checked. No one asked her to cross-reference the labels. She just did. The overnight charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Terrell Briggs, gave her a tired look when she flagged it. "Good catch," he said, without looking up from his screen. That was about as much recognition as any given Tuesday offered. She walked to her car in the east lot under a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and rain, her badge still clipped to her scrubs, her feet aching in the way that meant she'd stood on concrete for 11 hours straight. The parking lot lights buzzed at the frequency that always reminded her of generators, the portable kind, the ones that powered field hospitals in places where power grids were a luxury nobody had. She pushed the thought away. She always pushed it away. Mara Sutton had spent the last 2.5 years becoming someone who didn't think about field hospitals. She had grown up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters, raised by a mother who worked dispatch and a father who fixed commercial HVAC systems and coached Little League on weekends. Normal, by most measures. Quiet childhood, decent grades. She'd wanted to be a doctor once, briefly, until she figured out that what she actually wanted was to be where the emergency was happening, not analyzing it afterward. At 19, she enlisted. She didn't advertise it, didn't make it a personality. She just went. 4 years became 8. 8 became a career she hadn't entirely planned on, working as a combat medical specialist attached to units that operated in environments most people didn't know existed. She'd done 2 deployments to mountainous terrain in Central Asia, 1 to a desert environment in the Middle East, and a final assignment she wasn't cleared to discuss. Even now, even with herself at 11:45 in a parking lot in the middle of a medium-sized city in Virginia. She'd been good at it, better than good. The call sign, Phantom, had started as a joke from her team leader, a stocky Georgian named Vasquez, who said watching her work a casualty was like watching a ghost move. She didn't make noise. She didn't hesitate. She just handled it, whatever it was, with a speed and certainty that other medics spent years trying to develop and sometimes never did. The name stuck. They all did. She left the military at 31 with an honorable discharge, a record she didn't talk about, and a private agreement with herself that she was done with the life that went with call signs. She got her civilian RN licensure. She moved to a city she didn't have connections to. She took a job at Harlow Peak Medical Center, which wasn't a level 1 trauma center but wasn't a small community hospital either. Mid-level, busy enough, anonymous enough. She'd thought she could just be a nurse, a regular nurse. She hadn't planned on Dr. Sandra Ewan. The first incident happened 3 weeks after Mara started. A pediatric near drowning came through the doors on a slow Wednesday afternoon. 6-year-old boy found unresponsive in a backyard pool, father performing CPR when EMS arrived. The child had a pulse by the time the ambulance reached Harlow Peak, but it was thin and irregular, and his breathing was labored in the specific way that told experienced eyes the situation was not over. Mara was in the hallway with her cart when the gurney blew past her. She followed at a distance to deliver the trauma kit that Bay 2 needed for the next incoming patient, and she was 3 feet from the doorway when she heard the resident give an order she recognized as wrong. Not technically wrong. Defensibly wrong. The kind of wrong that, in a stable adult with a different history, might have been reasonable. But for a 6-year-old with a prolonged submersion and the specific respiratory pattern she could hear from the hallway, the order created a risk that the resident likely hadn't calculated. She stepped into the doorway. She said one sentence. She kept her voice flat and low so only the resident could hear. He looked at her. He looked at the patient. He modified the order. The boy stabilized. Nobody connected what she'd said to the outcome. The resident didn't bring it up. Mara went back to her cart. But Sandra Ewan had been standing at the nursing station, and she had seen Mara step into that doorway. The conversation happened in the supply corridor the next morning. Ewan came in alone, which was unusual. She typically had at least one resident trailing her like a shadow, and she closed the door, which made the already narrow corridor feel like a closet. "You stepped into an active trauma bay yesterday." Mara kept sorting the delivery she was unpacking. "I was dropping off supplies. You said something to Dr. Osei. I mentioned something I observed. He made his own call." "That's not how it works here." Ewan's voice was controlled, the way a person's voice gets when they're choosing each word for a specific effect. "You are supply staff. Supply staff do not comment on clinical decisions. Do you understand that?" Mara looked at her. "The kid did okay." "That is completely irrelevant to what I'm telling you." "Is it?" The silence that followed was the kind that rewrites relationships permanently. Ewan was not a woman who was accustomed to being answered with questions. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "If I see you in a clinical space that you haven't been assigned to again," she said, "I will file a formal complaint with HR and have your contract reviewed. Are we clear?" Mara set down the package she was holding. "Yes," she said. "We're clear." Ewan left. Mara finished the delivery. She told herself it was fine, that she was here to be invisible, and that invisible didn't require justice. It just required discipline. She had more of that than most people she'd ever met. Over the following months, the terms of her existence at Harlow Peak became a kind of unofficial policy that everyone seemed to understand without it ever being written down. Dr. Ewan had allies, which was less about friendship and more about institutional gravity. When a physician with 12 years at a hospital and a department head title decides someone is a problem, that information travels. Not overtly. Not with memos. Through small decisions, through the slow accumulation of being excluded. The charge nurses stopped assigning Mara to any patient interaction. She was rerouted from floor duties she'd been performing to a full-time supply and inventory role, which was not technically a demotion because no one called it a demotion. It was a workflow adjustment that the department administrator, a thin man named Jeffrey Price, explained to her with the particular tone of someone who had been told what to say and was saying it. "Your background is better suited to logistics support at this time," Price had told her, in his office behind a desk that was too large for the room. What does that mean exactly? It means supply and inventory. That's not what I was hired for. Your role has been adjusted. He'd straightened a pen on his desk. If you have concerns, there's an HR process. There was always a process. The process rarely helped the person who needed it. Mara filed nothing. She said nothing. She went back to the supply cart, and she kept doing the work that nobody noticed, and she told herself again that this was fine, that she'd chosen this life precisely because it was quiet, because it was contained, because it was the opposite of what she'd spent a decade doing. But the other thing about combat medicine, the thing that never quite leaves you, is that you learn to read rooms. You learn to understand the difference between situations that are stable and situations that are about to become something else entirely. And sometime around her 5th month at Harlow Peak, Mara started feeling the subtle, specific weight of a situation that wasn't stable. The problem with Dr. Ewan, and Mara had spent some quiet late shift hours thinking about this, wasn't arrogance. Arrogance in medicine was common, was almost expected, was sometimes even functional. A certain level of unjustified confidence in the right setting could project the kind of authority that kept chaotic trauma bays organized. The problem was something subtler. It was the way Ewan responded to being wrong. Mara had now watched her manage 7 major trauma cases from a distance, close enough to observe, far enough that she couldn't be accused of stepping into a clinical space. And she'd noticed a pattern that made her chest feel tight in the way that specific types of danger used to. When a clinical decision didn't produce the expected result, Ewan's response was not to question the decision. It was to reroute the narrative, to identify the nearest contributing factor that wasn't herself and elevate it until it absorbed the outcome. A nurse's documentation, a delayed lab result, equipment that was, according to Ewan's account, not properly stocked. That last one had been aimed at Mara, indirectly, twice. Both times the documentation showed the supplies were exactly where they were supposed to be, because Mara kept her inventory with a rigor that bordered on obsessive. But the comment made it into shift reports. The shift reports accumulated, and by month 6, there were 2 HR notes in Mara's file for supply chain discrepancies that she could not trace to any actual discrepancy, only to the general gravitational pull of someone with authority deciding that blame required a destination. She thought about quitting, more than once. She thought about it seriously on a rainy Thursday in October, sitting in her car in the east lot, her hands on the steering wheel, her shift badge still clipped to her collar. She didn't quit. Not because she needed the job. She'd been disciplined with her finances for years. She could have left and taken 6 months to figure out something else. She didn't quit because there was a part of her, a part she didn't fully understand and wasn't entirely comfortable examining, that recognized the hospital was understaffed in trauma support, that recognized the patients moving through Harlow Peak's ER were being served by a system with gaps in it, and that staying in the building, even in the supply corridor, meant she was 1 degree closer to filling those gaps when they appeared. She just hadn't expected the gap to arrive the way it did. The first alert came at 2:31 a.m. on a Wednesday. It wasn't the standard radio call that preceded ambulance runs. It was a secure line coming into the hospital administrator's office, the kind that most hospital staff didn't know existed, and it triggered a secondary notification to the ER charge nurse that read, in the clinical shorthand that had been developed for these situations, MIL trauma incoming. ETA 16 minutes. Prepare Bay 1 and support. Terrell Briggs, the overnight charge, read the notification twice. He'd worked Harlow Peak for 11 years, and he'd had one prior military emergency in all that time. A National Guard transport accident, 2 broken legs, nothing especially complicated. This notification had a code marker he didn't recognize. He paged the overnight attending. He woke the on-call trauma team. He stood at the nursing station with the alert on his screen and tried to understand what exactly was coming through his doors. At 2:41, Mara came in through the ambulance bay entrance. She wasn't scheduled. Her shift didn't start until 7. She was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie and her hospital badge, and she had driven in without entirely knowing why, only that she'd woken at 2:15 from something that wasn't quite a dream and wasn't quite instinct, and she'd been unable to stay in her apartment. "You're not on tonight," Terrell said when she pushed through the doors. "I know." She looked at the alert on his screen. She read it in under 3 seconds. Her expression didn't change. "What's the code marker?" Terrell looked at her. He'd always found her a little odd, too quiet, too observant, too careful in the way that people who were carrying something tended to be careful. "It's above my clearance level. They wouldn't tell me more than the basics. How many inbound?" "1. Critical." "What time?" He checked. 6 minutes ago, they updated to 9 minutes out. She nodded slowly. She took off her hoodie and draped it over the nursing station counter. Under it, she had on a plain blue long-sleeve shirt. She didn't explain what she was doing. She walked to the supply room, retrieved 2 trauma kits that weren't scheduled to be pulled until morning inventory, and carried them toward Bay 1 without being asked. Terrell watched her go. He almost said something. He didn't. Bay 1 was already organized. Terrell's team had done a reasonable job in the 6 minutes they'd had, but Mara walked the space with the specific attention of someone who was not checking a list. She was building a map. She repositioned the thoracic tray. She moved the defibrillator 6 inches to the left so it wouldn't be blocked when a second person entered from the door side. She pulled a second laryngoscope and set it below the primary where it could be reached without looking. The overnight attending, a compact man named Dr. Jonas Merritt, who Mara had never spoken more than 12 words to, appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the repositioned equipment. He opened his mouth. The external doors of the ambulance bay exploded with sound before he could say anything. It wasn't an ambulance. It was 2 military vehicles, black, unmarked, that pulled into the ambulance bay with a controlled precision that told Mara these were not soldiers who were unfamiliar with hospital procedures. The lead vehicle barely stopped before 2 figures in tactical gear were out and moving, pulling a stretcher from the rear of the second vehicle with a practiced efficiency that was different from the way civilian EMTs moved. Faster, lower energy expenditure, everything stripped down to function. A third figure, taller than the others, moving with the kind of authority that doesn't require volume, came through the ER doors first. The man was in his late 40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been formed under pressure, and eyes that swept the room in a single pass and missed nothing. He wore no insignia that Mara could read from across the bay, but she knew the way he moved, the way his gaze prioritized exits and personnel in a specific order that wasn't civilian. She'd worked with people who moved like that. She'd been one of them. He said, in a voice that carried without effort, "We need Nurse Phantom, right now. Where is she?" The ER went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something unusual has stopped everyone's internal narrative. Terrell Briggs turned slowly from the desk. Dr. Merritt looked at his charge nurse. The 2 overnight floor nurses who'd come down to assist looked at each other. Nobody said a name. Nobody moved toward this man. The man's eyes did another pass. Slower this time, landing on faces, discarding them, moving on. Mara was standing inside Bay 1, partially behind the equipment tray she'd repositioned. She had been still since the vehicles pulled in. She was watching the men bring the stretcher through the doors, watching the wounded soldier's color, watching the way one of the tactical medics was maintaining pressure with both hands on the left side of the patient's chest, which told her more about the injury than any verbal report would. She already knew what she was looking at. She stepped out from behind the tray. She didn't raise her voice, she just made herself visible. And the tall man's eyes found her in under 2 seconds and stopped. "You're Phantom," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's been a while since anyone called me that," she said. He nodded once, like that was the only confirmation he needed, and turned to wave the stretcher in. "Bay 1, she said. "I've already set it up." The stretcher moved past her. The tactical medic, young, controlled, sweating through his gear, met her eyes as he passed and said, fast and low, "Left hemothorax, suspected tension component. 70 over palp. He's been down 8 minutes. How much blood on scene?" "Significant. We packed it. 2 large bore IVs, lactated ringer wide open." "Airway?" "His own, but it's working hard." She was already moving. Dr. Merritt appeared at her left shoulder. "Sutton, I need a 36 French chest tube, a flutter valve, and whoever among your nurses has trauma experience," she said, without looking at him. "And I need them now, not in 30 seconds. Merritt stopped. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that in his own ER. He looked at Terrell. Terrell, who had been watching Mara Sutton for 11 seconds with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already understood, turned to the cabinet and pulled the chest tube kit without being asked again. The patient was on the Bay 1 table. Mara pulled on gloves and moved to the left side. He was a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered in the way that came from specific physical conditioning rather than general fitness, with a face that was pale in the way that blood pressure made faces pale. His lips had the color that meant he was close. His chest was rising unevenly, the right side more than the left, and the tactical medic's pack was wet through. She pressed 2 fingers against the left chest wall, felt the resistance that confirmed what she already knew. Behind her, Dr. Merritt was talking. She could hear him calibrating his voice back towards authority, processing what was happening and reaching for the version of this situation where he was still in charge of it. "We need to assess the—" "He's got maybe 4 minutes, Mara said. She said it clearly, without drama, the way a person reports a fact. "The tension component is building. We decompress now, or we lose the window." Silence. The tall soldier who had positioned himself to the right of the bay without being asked to leave said, "Do it." And Mara Sutton, who for 7 months had been the woman no one noticed, the woman who restocked gloves and reorganized supply shelves and stayed invisible at the edges of a hospital that had decided she was nothing, put her hands on a dying soldier and went to work. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing Terrell Briggs noticed first, standing at the supply cabinet with the chest tube kit in his hands, watching a woman he'd known for 7 months as the person who reorganized the gauze pads suddenly become someone he didn't recognize at all. Her hands moved with the specific economy of someone who had done this in conditions far worse than a clean trauma bay with functioning overhead lights and a full supply rack. No wasted motion. No checking the tray twice. Her left hand located the landmarks on the patient's chest wall, the way a musician finds a key without looking at the keyboard, and her right hand was already prepped before most of the room had processed what she was doing. Dr. Jonas Merritt had gone quiet. That, in Terrell's experience, was rarer than what Mara's hands were doing. Merritt was not a passive man. He'd run Harlow Peak's overnight trauma response for 4 years, and he had a particular way of occupying space in a trauma bay, central, vocal, authoritative in the specific manner of someone who had learned that authority required performance. He would typically be at the head of this bed. He would typically be directing the sequence. The fact that he was standing 2 feet to the left of the door, watching, said more about what he was seeing than any words could have. "Terrell," Mara said, without looking up. 36 French. Now." He moved. The tactical medics obeyed him. The young one, whose name tag read Del Rey, had repositioned himself to the patient's right side and was maintaining the IV lines with a focus that told Mara he'd worked with people who didn't need to be managed. She filed that away. A good partner in a trauma bay was someone who understood what they didn't need to be told. "What's his name?" she asked Del Rey. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb." She registered it. "Marcus," she said, not loudly, just toward the man's face, the way you spoke to someone who was still inside their body, even when their body was failing. "I've got you. Stay with me." Webb's eyes moved. They didn't focus, but they moved, which was something. She took the chest tube kit from Terrell, confirmed the size without pausing, and made the incision at the 5th intercostal space, left lateral, clean, direct, The kind of cut that in a civilian OR took 3 people to prepare for, and in a field setting took 4 seconds. The blood that followed was the specific dark color that confirmed her read. She guided the tube, felt the resistance give, and connected the flutter valve that Terrell had ready at her elbow. The sound that followed, the release of pressure, the shift in the patient's respiratory pattern, made 2 of the overnight nurses exhale audibly. Merritt stepped forward. I need his pressure checked, Mara said. She wasn't sharp. She wasn't dismissive. She just needed the information. Right now. One of the floor nurses, a woman named Donna, 50s, who Terrell knew had 30 years of ER experience and didn't rattle easily, moved to the BP cuff without being asked to choose between Mara and Merritt. She just did the useful thing. 84/52. Coming up, Mara said. Give it 90 seconds. She was watching the tube, watching Webb's chest wall, watching the color moving back into his face the way color returned. Slowly, imperfectly, not like a switch thrown, but like something that had to be coaxed back from a long distance. The tall soldier, who had not left the doorway, was watching her with an expression that wasn't readable as relief, exactly, but as something adjacent to it. The particular look of a person who had expected to witness a specific outcome and was in the process of revising that expectation. 92/60, Donna said. Keep the ringer running, Mara said. I want blood typed and crossed, 2 units on standby, and someone needs to get a portable chest x-ray in here in the next 8 minutes. She looked at Merritt directly for the first time since she'd gloved up. He'll need a CT to rule out additional hemorrhage. The tube handled the immediate problem. The CT will tell us what we're still dealing with. Merritt looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Donna. Get radiology. Donna was already on the phone. The tall soldier's name was Colonel James Ruark, and he made no move to introduce himself until Webb was stable enough that the immediate noise of the trauma bay had settled into the steadier rhythm of monitoring equipment and controlled activity. He appeared at Mara's left shoulder while she was documenting the procedure on the bay's wall tablet, something she'd begun doing automatically because she knew that what she'd just done existed in a complicated space between her role and the role she wasn't supposed to have, and documentation was the only protection that mattered when complications came looking. How long has it been? Ruark asked. She didn't ask what he meant. 2.5 years since I separated, longer since I worked in that kind of environment. Doesn't look like it. I know what a tension hemothorax looks like. She kept typing. It's not something you forget. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the silence as the kind that was doing work, the kind where someone was deciding how much to say. We got intel that you were here 6 months ago, he said finally. We've been sitting on it. She stopped typing. She looked at him. Sitting on it, she said. There were operational considerations. And now? His jaw tightened slightly. Now Webb needed the best field-trained trauma medic on the East Coast, and the only name on the list that had a reliable civilian location was yours. She held his gaze for a moment, then went back to the tablet. He's going to need the CT. If there's a second bleeder they didn't catch on scene, the tube won't be enough. I understand. He paused. Phantom? Sutton, she said. It's just Sutton here. Another silence. This one different. Not calculating, more like adjustment. Sutton, we're going to need to talk about what happened tonight and what comes next. I know, she said. But right now what comes next is the CT, so let's focus on that. The CT showed what she'd suspected, a secondary venous bleed smaller than the first, contained but precarious. Webb went up to the OR at 3:47 a.m. with a surgical team that Mara had briefed in the hallway outside radiology, talking through the images with a specificity that made the vascular surgeon, a careful, methodical man named Dr. Philip Ostrander, who'd been pulled out of on-call sleep, look at her twice before saying anything. You read vascular CT imaging, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've seen a lot of chest trauma, she said. He studied her for another second. Where? Complicated places, she said, and turned back to the images. He didn't push it. Webb went into surgery with a stable pressure and a surgical team that understood what they were looking at. Mara stood outside the OR doors for 30 seconds after they closed, her hands at her sides, her pulse doing the slow descent from operational to something closer to normal that used to take her an hour and now took less time because she'd had years to practice it. Then she went to find the consequences. They found her first. She was in the corridor outside radiology, pulling off her gloves, when she heard the heels on the linoleum, the specific sharp rhythm that had become, over 7 months, a sound she registered the way some people registered weather changes. Dr. Sandra Ewan was not scheduled for this shift. It was 4:12 in the morning. She was in full professional dress, pressed coat, stethoscope, lanyard over the left shoulder, which meant she'd been called, or she'd heard through whatever network she maintained, and she'd come in specifically for this. Her face was composed. That was always the most dangerous version of Ewan. "Dr. Merritt called me," she said. "At 4 in the morning," Mara said. "He was concerned about an unauthorized clinical intervention." She said it evenly, the way you stated a fact, which is, in fact, a serious matter. The patient has a stable blood pressure and he's in surgery. That's not the point. Then what's the point? Ewan's eyes were doing the particular thing they did when she was working through how to arrange a situation. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization. You are on supply staff rotation. You have no current cleared clinical assignment at this hospital. What you did tonight constitutes a significant breach of protocol, and I want you to understand that there will be a formal review. Mara looked at her. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, and not rage either, but the particular specific exhaustion of watching a person absorb a situation and immediately locate the angle from which they could make it about authority rather than outcome. "He was 4 minutes from dying," she said. "That is not your determination to make. It was the only determination that mattered at the time. You are supply staff, Sutton." Ewan's voice dropped slightly, which was more unnerving than if she'd raised it. "You have been supply staff for 7 months. You do not make clinical determinations. That is not your position. That is not your role. And if you cannot understand that, then your position at this hospital becomes very difficult to defend." The corridor was empty except for the two of them and the distant sound of the night shift's machinery. Mara said very quietly, "Then maybe don't defend it." Ewan blinked. It was small. Barely visible, but it was there. "Excuse me? If my position here is indefensible, then don't defend it. File whatever review you need to file." She pulled off the second glove. "I need to go check on my patient. He is not your—" "Good night, Dr. Ewan." She walked away. She kept her pace even. She felt Ewan's gaze on her back the entire length of the corridor, and she didn't turn around once. Webb came out of surgery at 6:50 a.m. Dr. Ostrander met Ruark in the OR waiting area with the careful body language of a surgeon who had good news and was delivering it with the appropriate professional caution. The secondary bleed had been tied off. No additional injuries on the table. Webb would spend time in the ICU, but barring complications, he was expected to recover full function. Ruark listened with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing, and when Ostrander finished, he said, "Where is Sutton?" Ostrander looked around. "I assumed she's not here," said Del Rey, who had been sitting in the corner of the waiting area for the past 3 hours in full tactical gear that he'd apparently decided was fine to wear in a hospital waiting room. Ruark looked at him. "She went back to the supply room," Del Rey said. "About an hour ago. I followed her to ask if she needed anything, and she was restocking a cart." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. "She was restocking a cart," Ruark repeated. "Yes, sir." Ruark uncrossed his arms. He walked down the corridor toward the supply room with the stride of a man who has recalculated something and is moving to correct it. She was counting suture kits. That was what she was doing when he pushed open the supply room door, standing at the third shelf with a clipboard and a box of size 30 monofilament, counting quietly to herself, her hair pulled back, her expression the specific neutral of someone who had made a private decision to be exactly where they were. "You could be in that waiting room," he said. "I know." "Webb is out of surgery. He's going to make it. She looked up from the clipboard. Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe, but the kind that had been expected, not the kind that was a surprise. She'd believed he was going to make it since his pressure crossed 90. That was when she'd allowed herself to believe it. Good, she said. Ruark closed the door behind him. He looked at the shelves. He looked at her. I've been doing this job for 22 years, he said. I have worked with some of the best trauma operators this country has produced in environments where the margin for error is zero. And I have never, not once, seen anyone work a tension hemothorax in a cold bay without a partner, with a team that wasn't prepped, as cleanly as you just did. She didn't say anything. Why are you counting suture kits? Because no one else does it at this hour, and they're always short on Thursdays. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She set the clipboard down. She looked at him steadily. I left because I wanted to leave. I made that choice. I can't keep revisiting it every time something like tonight happens. Tonight isn't something like tonight, he said. Webb is a Tier 1 asset. The mission he was extracted from is still active. We lost 2 people getting him out. The team is... He stopped, reorganized. There are people who want to know if you're still operational. The word landed differently than she'd thought it would. She'd thought, in the abstract, that she'd prepared for this conversation. She'd told herself, in the 2.5 years since she'd separated, that she knew what she would say if it ever came. She had a clear, practiced position. She wasn't going back. She had a life here. Modest, constrained, invisibility enforced by people like Yuen, but hers. She had chosen it. She looked at the suture kits. I'm going to need to think about that, she said. It was not the answer she'd planned to give. Ruark looked at her for a long moment. Take whatever time you need. He moved to leave, then stopped with his hand on the door. She filed a report, by the way. Yuen, about 40 minutes ago. I don't know what it says, but Merritt told me she flagged it as an unauthorized procedure. Mara looked at him. In case that affects your timeline, Sus, he said. He left. The door swung shut behind him. She stood in the supply room with the suture kits and the clipboard and the buzz of the fluorescent light that had been slightly off frequency for the 3 months since maintenance said they'd fix it and hadn't, and she let the weight of the last 4 hours settle fully onto her shoulders for the first time since the sound of those vehicles outside had sent everything into motion. She was not afraid of Yuen's report. She was, if she was being honest with herself, something more complicated than afraid. She was tired. Not physically. The adrenaline come down was familiar enough that she could work through it on autopilot, but tired in the specific way that comes from spending 7 months being treated as if you are less than what you are, from making yourself small enough to fit inside a role that was designed to contain you, from watching a system protect itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. And now the system was going to come for the one night she'd stopped containing herself. She picked up the clipboard. She finished counting the suture kits. Desit. The morning shift came in at 7, and with it came the particular voltage of a hospital that had processed something unusual overnight and was now in the process of deciding what to do with the information. Mara felt it the moment she stepped back into the main corridor. The looks that weren't quite looks, the way certain pairs of eyes moved away a fraction too quickly or stayed a fraction too long. The nurses who'd been there overnight had talked. That was inevitable. The story had moved in the way that stories in closed environments always moved, fast and imperfect, picking up details in some places and dropping them in others. What remained consistent across all the versions, she suspected, was the part she'd played in it. She had 2 hours left before her shift was officially over. She could have left. Her arrival at 2:41 wasn't on any schedule, and no one had processed a time card for it. But leaving felt like the wrong move. Leaving felt like retreat. And she'd spent 7 months retreating into supply closets, and she was finding this morning that she had less appetite for it than she'd had the night before. She was at the nursing station updating the overnight supply intake when Jeffrey Price appeared. Price moved through the hospital the way certain administrative types moved, always purposeful looking, never quite arriving at anything. He had the administrator's specific relationship with eye contact, which was to deploy it selectively as an instrument of authority rather than communication. He was deploying it now, directed at her, which meant whatever he was carrying was something he'd been sent to deliver. Mara. He stopped at the counter. Dr. Ewan has requested an emergency review meeting this morning. She kept typing. About last night. About last night? Yes. There are some concerns about the scope of your activities. I saved a patient's life. The hospital has protocols about who performs. The patient is in the ICU with a stable blood pressure, she said. If I'd waited for the correct protocol, he'd be in the morgue. Price's expression did the thing it did when he encountered resistance he hadn't prepared for. A brief recalibration, subtle but visible to anyone who'd spent time watching him. That's a conversation for the review. What time? 9 o'clock, conference room B. She looked up from the screen. I'll be there. He nodded, adjusted his lanyard, and left the same direction he'd come from. She watched him go. Then she looked back at the screen, at the supply intake form she'd been filling out, at the line items for the trauma kits she'd pulled at 2:38 a.m. before anyone else had understood what was coming. She documented it all. Every kit, every timestamp, every item she'd used and why. Because documentation was the only armor that couldn't be taken off you. And so, conference room B was a beige rectangle with a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted screen nobody ever used, and a smell of old coffee that the ventilation system had clearly accepted as permanent. Mara arrived at 8:54 and found Sandra Ewan already seated at the head of the table, which was a choice that told her everything she needed to know about how this meeting had been framed. Price sat to Ewan's right. Beside him was a woman from HR named Judith Okafor, whom Mara recognized from the orientation she'd attended 9 months ago. Efficient, neutral, present in the way that HR personnel were present at these meetings, which was as witnesses first and participants second. Dr. Merritt was there too. He was seated across from Price, and he was looking at the table, which was not the posture of a man who had come to contribute. Mara sat down across from Ewan. Thank you for coming, Ewan said. She had a folder in front of her. Mara could see the edge of a printed document, the formal complaint, most likely, or the draft of one. Ewan put her hand on it without opening it. I want to start by acknowledging that last night was a high-pressure situation. I understand that. Mara said nothing. But high pressure doesn't change the institutional framework, Ewan continued. And the institutional framework is clear. You are not cleared for clinical procedure. You performed an invasive thoracic intervention. Regardless of outcome, that is a liability issue for this hospital, and it needs to be addressed formally. Addressed how? Mara said. Ewan glanced at Price. We'll be recommending a suspension pending full review of your employment record and the events of last night. During that suspension, your access to clinical areas, including supply rooms, will be limited. Mara looked at her. You're suspending me. The hospital is initiating a review process, yes. For saving a patient. For operating outside your designated role. She looked down the table at Merritt. He was still studying the surface in front of him. Dr. Merritt, she said. He looked up. You were there, she said. You saw what his pressure was when he came in. You saw what the chest wall looked like. You saw the time we had. Merritt's jaw moved. He was a man in the specific position of someone who knew the truth and had been in the same room with the truth all night and was now being asked to choose between the truth and the system that employed him. He looked at Ewan. He looked back at the table. The review process exists for situations like this, he said. His voice was flat. I think we should let it work. Something settled in Mara's chest. Not surprise. She'd known Merritt for less than 12 hours, but she'd known his type longer than that. People who understood what was right and chose the easier answer anyway, not from malice, but from the specific cowardice of not wanting to be the one standing in the open when the wind changed. She looked back at Ewan. Ewan's expression was the composed kind, the version where the outcome had already been determined and the meeting was the formality that preceded it. When does the suspension begin? Mara asked. Effective end of your current shift. Mara nodded once. She gathered nothing because she had nothing with her. She pushed back her chair. I want copies of everything, she said. Every document, every complaint, every item in my file. I want them by noon. Ewan's composure flickered, just briefly. It's my legal right, Mara said. "I'll be in the supply room until my shift ends." She stood up. And that was when the conference room door opened. Colonel James Ruark walked in. He was not alone. Behind him came a woman in a charcoal suit that had the specific cut of federal professional dress, carrying a leather portfolio and moving with the economy of motion that Mara recognized from briefing rooms she'd sat in once, in a different life. The woman was somewhere in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the expression of someone who had sat across from more difficult tables than this one and had not lost. Rourke looked at the assembled group. His eyes stopped on Ewan. "Dr. Ewan," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. I'm Colonel James Ruark, and this is Ms. Adrienne Voss from the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense." He said it the way a person might announce a weather event that everyone was now going to have to work around. "We're going to need a few minutes." The room went very still. Ewan's hand was still flat on the folder. The color at the edge of her jaw had changed in a way that foundation couldn't entirely cover. Voss set her portfolio on the table without being invited to. She opened it. She placed a single printed document in front of Ewan and then one in front of Price, and then she sat down with the particular ease of someone who had already determined the geometry of the room before she walked into it. "The procedure performed by Ms. Sutton last night," Voss said, in the precise tone of a person who measured words before deploying them, "was consistent with emergency battlefield medical protocol and was performed on a member of an active special operations unit currently operating under DoD jurisdiction." She paused. "The outcome of that procedure has been reviewed by the DoD Medical Board. They had some questions about the hospital's decision to place Ms. Sutton in a non-clinical role." Nobody spoke. Voss looked up. Her eyes were the particular color of patience with a hard edge underneath it. "Specifically," she said, "they want to understand why a nurse with Ms. Sutton's documented credentials was restricted from patient care." Ewan's mouth opened, and for the first time in 7 months, Sandra Ewan did not immediately find the words. The silence in conference room B had a specific quality to it, the kind that forms when people who are accustomed to controlling situations realize simultaneously that they are no longer controlling this one. Ewan's mouth closed. She looked at the document Voss had placed in front of her, and Mara watched her eyes move across the top third of the page, not reading exactly, but scanning for the specific words that would tell her how serious this was and how quickly she needed to recalibrate. Whatever she found there made her set the paper down with a care that was itself a kind of answer. Price had gone the particular shade of beige that matched the walls. Judith Okafor, the HR representative, had opened her notepad and begun writing something with the focused energy of a person who had decided that documentation was her best available shelter. Ruark pulled out the chair beside Mara and sat down without being invited to, which was not rudeness so much as the simple physics of a man who had spent 2 decades in environments where you either occupied the space or you didn't. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at Ewan. "I want to be clear about what this is," he said. "This is not a hostile proceeding. Ms. Voss is here in an oversight capacity, and her office has jurisdiction because the patient treated last night is an active-duty Special Operations Service member under a classified operational command. That means what happened in that trauma bay last night falls partially under DoD medical review protocols." He paused. "Which means the decisions made in this room this morning are also under that review." Ewan found her voice. It was controlled. That was what Mara had to concede about her. She was rarely not controlled. "With respect, Colonel, the hospital has its own review process, and—" "I've read the complaint you filed at 4:47 this morning," Voss said, without looking up from her portfolio. "I've also read Ms. Sutton's personnel file, which was provided to our office by hospital administration as part of the standard information request we submitted at 00300. Ewan went still. "We sent the request before we left the base," Rourke said, simply, like it was obvious. Voss finally looked up. She had the kind of eye contact that didn't require volume to carry weight. "Dr. Ewan, can you walk me through the decision to reassign Ms. Sutton from clinical nursing duties to supply and inventory management?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ewan picked up her folder. She opened it. She was buying 3 seconds, and everyone at the table could see her buying them. The reassignment was based on workflow considerations and an assessment of Ms. Sutton's fit within the clinical team. An assessment based on what criteria? Performance observations, team integration. Were there formal performance reviews? A beat. The process was ongoing. Voss wrote something. So there were no formal reviews. The process, Dr. Yuen. Voss's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In 7 months, there are no formal performance reviews, no documented clinical evaluations, no written record of any incident that would justify removing a registered nurse from patient care. What I do have is 2 HR notes citing supply chain discrepancies that your own inventory logs contradict. She set her pen down. So I'll ask again, what was the actual basis for the reassignment? Mara stopped listening to Yuen's answer. Not because it wasn't relevant, it was, deeply, but because she had been in interrogation-adjacent rooms before, and she knew when a trained professional was handling the situation, and Adrienne Voss did not need her participation right now. What Mara needed, she realized, was air. She stood up. Ruark looked at her. She met his eyes and tilted her head toward the door, and he gave a small nod that meant, "Go, I have this." She walked out of Conference Room B into the corridor, where the hospital was doing the ordinary business of a Thursday morning, gurneys moving, a PA announcement for pharmacy pickup in room 412, a child crying somewhere down the west wing with the specific exhausted quality that meant they'd been crying for a while. All of it normal. All of it the same world she'd been existing in for 7 months, slightly rearranged. She walked to the end of the corridor to the window that overlooked the east parking lot. The morning had gone gray since she'd arrived, a low ceiling of cloud that flattened the light and made the cars in the lot look like they were arranged for a purpose they didn't have. She stood there with her arms at her sides and let herself breathe for 60 seconds in the specific rhythmic way she'd been taught years ago as a method for returning the nervous system from operational state to functional state. It didn't work as well as it used to. It hadn't for years. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered anyway. "Sutton?" The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 14 months. Low, slightly raspy, the permanent residue of a vocal cord injury from an incident she'd been present for. "It's Vasquez." She closed her eyes briefly. "How did you get this number?" "Ruark's people. I'm in the building." She turned away from the window. "Where?" "Cafeteria. Come down when you can. We need to talk before the meeting goes much further." "What meeting? The one that's already happening?" "The other one," he said. "The one that starts in about 40 minutes. She didn't ask what he meant. The tone told her it was the kind of thing that needed a room, not a hallway. "Give me 10 minutes. She ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at the gray ceiling of cloud through the window, and thought about the specific way a situation could appear to be resolving while simultaneously becoming something much larger than you planned for. Then she took the stairs to the cafeteria. Darnell Vasquez was sitting at a corner table with a coffee he wasn't drinking, in civilian clothes that fit him the way civilian clothes always fit people like him. Adequately, but clearly not naturally. He was 43, shorter than most people expected when they met him in person, with the build of someone who had been doing difficult physical work for 2 decades and hadn't stopped, and a face that had accumulated more weather than his age strictly called for. He looked at her when she sat down across from him, and the look he gave her was the kind that old colleagues give each other when too much time has passed for the usual openers to work. "You look tired," he said. "I've been up since 2. I mean generally." She picked up his coffee and drank some of it because it was there and she needed it. He let her. "What's the other meeting, Vasquez?" He wrapped both hands around the cup when she set it back. "The situation Webb was extracted from. It's not resolved. The team is still in the field, what's left of it. And there's an intelligence component to what happened to him that the DoD is treating as active and time-sensitive." He looked at the table. There was a medical failure in the chain of support. The forward surgical team that was supposed to be pre-positioned for that extraction wasn't where it was supposed to be, and 2 of the people responsible for that positioning are now under investigation. "What kind of investigation?" The kind that goes up the chain a long way. He met her eyes. Webb's injury wasn't just bad luck. Someone had information about the extraction corridor, and the medical support gap was, let's say it's being looked at as possibly intentional. She sat with that. How does that connect to this hospital? It doesn't, directly. He turned the cup. But the reason they needed you specifically, right now, isn't only because you're here. It's because the DoD medical board that reviewed what happened to Webb last night, and they reviewed it fast, Sutton, within 4 hours, which tells you how high this goes. They flagged you as a critical medical asset in connection with the ongoing operation. What operation? He looked at her steadily. The one Webb was on before he got hit. She didn't respond to that. There are 2 other members of his team still in a location I can't name in this room, Vasquez continued, his voice dropping without him seeming to choose to drop it. They have a compromised medical situation and a closing window for support, and the same people who signed off on Webb's extraction specifically requested your name for the forward role. I'm a civilian. You have a current RN license, an active DoD security clearance that technically never expired because no one filed the termination correctly, and a medical record from your service that qualifies you for emergency contractor status under a specific provision that Ms. Voss has the paperwork for. He paused. They didn't find you by accident 6 months ago, Sutton. They've been watching the situation here. They knew about Ewan. They knew what she was doing to you. They waited because the operational picture wasn't ready. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the cafeteria windows, an ambulance was pulling into the bay. Routine, from the pace of it, nothing like the controlled violence of last night's arrival. They used the situation here, she said. It wasn't a question. They let it develop, he said, which was a careful distinction. That's a significant difference. I know. She stood up. She needed to move. She walked 2 steps toward the window, stopped, turned back. If I'd quit 6 months ago. You didn't. If I had. He looked at her. Then we'd have found another way to reach you, but you didn't quit, which told them something about where you were. She stared at him. That's manipulation, Darnell. Yes, he said. He didn't dress it up. She appreciated that about him more than almost anything else. She sat back down. She pressed the heels of her hands against the table edge. What's the timeline on the other 2? 36 hours, maybe less, before their medical situation becomes unmanageable without intervention. What are they dealing with? One penetrating abdominal injury, packed and stable but not surgically addressed. One head injury with increased ICP symptoms. That one's the more urgent. She calculated it. She didn't want to, but the math ran itself anyway. Increased intracranial pressure with a closing treatment window in a field environment was a specific kind of countdown that she knew better than she knew most things about herself. Who else is on the medical team? Delray. One other medic named Ferris, who you haven't met. They need a lead. Delray's good, she said. I saw him work last night. I know. He also asked for you by name, which, given that he's 26 and has been doing this for 3 years, says something. She exhaled through her nose. I need to know exactly what I'm walking into. Environment, access, support, extraction plan if it goes wrong. Everything. Vasquez's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the adjacent thing. That sounds like a yes. That sounds like someone who doesn't make decisions without information. She picked up the empty coffee cup. When does Ruark need an answer? He's going to need it before noon. Then I have 2 hours. She stood up again. And I have something to finish upstairs first. She was back in conference room B at 9:41. The geometry of the room had changed while she was gone. Ewan was still at the head of the table, but she had physically contracted. Not much, not in any way she could be accused of, but enough that the distance between her shoulders and the chair back was measurable. The folder was still in front of her, but she'd closed it, which meant she'd stopped pretending it was a resource and accepted it was a prop. Price was writing something on his phone under the table with the focused desperation of a man trying to reach someone who wasn't picking up. Merritt was still looking at the table, but differently now, with the expression of a man who had been in a room long enough for the room to have changed around him. Voss had papers spread in front of her with the deliberate organization of someone who was building a record in real time. Ruark looked up when Mara came in. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She sat down. She looked at Ewan. Ewan looked back at her. Something had shifted in Ewan's composure. Not broken, because Ewan was not the kind of person whose composure simply broke, but altered. Like a load-bearing wall that has been subjected to more pressure than its design specification and has begun to show it in the specific quiet ways that precede larger events. Ms. Voss was walking Dr. Yuan through the institutional history, Rourke said. Not unkindly, just factually. I heard some of it from the hallway, Mara said. Voss looked at her. Are you ready to continue? Yes. Voss turned back to Ewan. Dr. Ewan, I want to return to the 2 HR notes in Ms. Sutton's file. The supply chain discrepancies dated March and May of this year. Ewan's hands were folded on the table. Those were documented incidents. They were documented notes. I don't see any supporting incident reports, any witness statements, or any inventory records that corroborate a discrepancy. Voss placed a page in front of Ewan. What I do have is the supply room's electronic inventory log, which is time-stamped and automatic. In both cases, the inventory was exactly as recorded. In March, it shows the cart was stocked correctly at the start of the shift. In May, the log shows a restock at 14:20 that matches the supply counts exactly. She paused. The HR notes were filed at 14:40 and 17:30, respectively, after the restocks. Ewan said nothing. Do you have documentation that contradicts the electronic log? The logs can have errors. They can, Voss agreed. Do you have any evidence of such an error in either of these specific instances? The silence was long enough to become its own answer. Mara watched Ewan's face. She watched the composure doing the work it was built to do, holding, and she felt something she hadn't entirely expected to feel, which was not triumph, but something heavier and less satisfying. Something that was closer to grief, maybe, or to the specific exhaustion of being right about something you'd wished you were wrong about. She hadn't wanted Ewan to be this. She'd wanted Ewan to be a difficult personality, an inflexible administrator, someone who made institutional life hard, but not someone who manufactured false records to displace blame. Because the second version meant the harm was intentional. An intentional harm required a different kind of accounting. Dr. Merritt, Voss said, turning to him, you were present in the trauma bay last night during Miss Sutton's intervention. In your clinical assessment, was her procedure medically indicated given the patient's presentation? Merritt's jaw tightened. The room waited. Mara looked at him. She didn't look away, not because she was applying pressure, but because she wanted to see who he decided to be. He looked at Voss. Yes, he said. The word came out with the specific weight of something that had required effort to lift. The patient had a tension hemothorax and a closing window. The procedure she performed was correct. Were you capable of performing the same procedure at that moment? He was quiet. I was assessing the situation. Is that a no? I was not in a position to act as quickly as she did. Why not? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had the flatness of honest accounting. Because I haven't worked a tension hemothorax without a full team in a clinical setting in 6 years. She moved like someone who'd done it in conditions I haven't worked in, Voss wrote. The scratching of her pen was the only sound. Mara looked at the table. The meeting ended at 10:50 without a formal resolution, which was itself a resolution of a kind. Voss collected her papers. She told Price she would need a full digital copy of every HR document related to Mara's employment by 3 p.m. She told Ewan that the DoD Medical Review Board would be in contact through official channels regarding the clinical events of last night. She said all of it with the same measured neutrality that she'd deployed throughout, and it wasn't until she was at the door that she stopped and turned back. Dr. Ewan, she said, I'd advise you to retain personal counsel before responding to any further inquiries from my office. She left. The room breathed differently after she was gone. Rourke stood. He looked at Mara. Walk with me. What? He took her to the east stairwell, the one that maintenance used, that smelled of concrete and cleaning product where the acoustics were too poor for the sound to travel. He stopped on the landing between the second and third floors and turned to face her. "Vasquez told you," he said. "Yes." "And?" She looked at the concrete wall. "The head injury. Increased ICP in a field setting, closed environment, limited equipment. What do they have on site?" "What Delray carried in plus a supplemental kit that Ferris had. No imaging, no surgical capacity. Monitoring is manual." "How are they communicating?" "Encrypted SAT relay, intermittent. The environment is electronically hostile." "They can get me in?" "Air insertion. 2-hour flight from a staging point. We have a window that opens at 1800 tonight and closes at 0200 tomorrow." She did the math. 16 hours from now. "Yes." She thought about the man with the increased ICP. She thought about what increased intracranial pressure felt like from the inside. The headache that became everything. The narrowing field of vision, the point where the body started making decisions the mind couldn't override. She'd seen it treated correctly twice in field conditions and incorrectly once, and she knew exactly which outcome was recoverable. "I need the full kit list," she said. "Everything Delray and Ferris have. I need to know what I'm working with before I get there." Rourke's expression did the thing it had done in the supply room earlier. The recalibration, the adjustment to a version of events he was revising in real time. "You're saying yes." "I'm saying I need the kit list," she repeated. "And I'm saying that whatever happens with Voss and Ewan and the review process needs to be handled without me in the room. Voss is capable. You have the documentation. My presence here isn't adding anything at this point." "What about your job?" She looked at him. "My job was supply inventory." He held her gaze. "What do you want it to be?" The question sat there in the concrete stairwell, and she didn't answer it right away because it was the question she'd been not answering for 2.5 years, and she still didn't have the full version of the answer ready. What she had was the partial version, the one that had walked out of a supply room at 3 in the morning and put her hands on a dying soldier and stopped being invisible for the first time since she'd arrived at Harlow Peak. "Send me the kit list," she said. "I'll have an answer for the rest of it when I get back." He nodded. He pulled out his phone. "I'll have Delray transmit the supply manifest within the hour." He started toward the stairs, then stopped. "The team leader on site, the one who requested you. He knows your record better than I do. He specifically said, and I'm quoting because it was unusual for him to say something like this, that if Phantom was still operational, she was the only person he trusted with his people." "Who's the team leader?" Rourke said the name. Mara went very still. She hadn't heard that name in 3 years. She'd assumed she wouldn't hear it again for reasons that existed in the specific gray space between operational security and the private histories that combatants accumulate and rarely discuss. "He's alive," she said. "He's alive. He's on site. And he's the one with the head injury." The concrete stairwell held the silence. Her hands were at her sides. They were not shaking, but the stillness in them was the deliberate kind, the kind that was managed, not natural. "What's his current status?" Her voice came out level. She'd trained herself long ago to ask clinical questions first. Conscious, oriented mostly. He knows his name and the date, photophobia, nausea, 2 vomiting episodes in the last 4 hours. Delray assessed the headache at 9 out of 10 and climbing. Increasing ICP, no imaging available. Deteriorating. The numbers arranged themselves in her mind with a precision that she couldn't turn off even when she wanted to. "What's the patient's name on the manifest?" she asked, because she needed to hear it. "Soldier 1, Rourke said, "for transmission security." "But you're telling me who it is." "I'm telling you in person because you had the right to know before you said yes." He paused, and because he asked me to. She pressed the heel of her hand against the stairwell wall. The concrete was cold. "Send me the kit list," she said, "and tell Delray to prep for 2. She started down the stairs. She was 2 flights down when her phone buzzed. She looked at it without stopping, a text from an unknown number, different from Vasquez's, with a single line of text that was clearly not from anyone in Rourke's circle, because it read, "We know you're going back in. Pull out of the insertion, and nothing at the hospital touches you. Do this, and everything UN filed goes active and permanent. She stopped on the landing. She read it again. Then she took a screenshot, texted it to Rourke's number with the single word received, put her phone in her pocket, and kept pocket and kept walking. Rourke's reply came back in under 90 seconds. Screenshot secured. Counter intel notified. Do not respond to number. Continue as planned. She kept walking. The stairwell door at ground level opened into the corridor outside the hospital pharmacy, which was the most ordinary part of Harlow Peak. Fluorescent overhead lights, a waiting area with plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a woman at the window asking about a prescription refill in a voice that suggested she'd been asking for a while. All of it unremarkable. All of it the texture of a normal Thursday morning that had no idea what was happening 2 floors up and in a concrete stairwell and somewhere several time zones away in a location she couldn't name. She walked through it and didn't slow down. The kit list from Delray came through at 11:47, a detailed text transmission that she read standing at the East Nursing Station, her back to the corridor, her eyes moving through the inventory with the specific attention of someone converting data into operational reality. What they had was adequate. What they didn't have was what she needed for the ICP management. She texted Ruark, need hypertonic saline 3% and mannitol 20%, neither on Delray's list. Can you source before 1800? His reply, working it. What quantities? She typed the dosing calculations from memory, not guessing, not approximating, but the actual numbers based on an estimated patient weight she pulled from Ruark's earlier description. If the team leader was who she thought he was, she knew his build within 10 pounds. She'd worked alongside him long enough to know his body the way field medics knew the people they kept alive. She sent the numbers. Then she stood for a moment at the nursing station and looked at the main ER bay from a distance. The controlled movement of morning shift, the ordinary choreography of a hospital doing what hospitals did. And she thought about the fact that in 6 hours she would be in a very different kind of room, doing a very different kind of work on a person she had last seen 3 years ago, under circumstances she had tried, with partial success, not to revisit. Sutton. She turned. Donna, the floor nurse, the one with 30 years of experience who had moved to the BP cuff last night without being asked to choose sides, was standing 3 feet away with a cup of coffee in each hand. She held one out. Mara looked at it. Thank you. You look like you've been up for 9 hours. 10. Donna nodded like that was the expected answer. She didn't ask about the meeting. She didn't ask about Ewan or Voss or the soldiers. She just stood there for a moment, drinking her own coffee, looking at the bay. For what it's worth, she said eventually, I've been a nurse for 31 years. I've worked with a lot of people. She paused. What you did last night, that wasn't luck. That wasn't instinct. That was a person who has done that before, a lot, in bad conditions. She looked at Mara directly. I don't know where you came from, but I'm glad you were here. Mara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was too hot to drink. She held it anyway. Thank you, Donna, she said. Donna went back to her station. Mara stood at the window of the ER for another 30 seconds. Then she went to find Vasquez and start the pre-mission process that she'd told herself 2.5 years ago she was finished with. They used a conference room on the administrative floor that Ruark had commandeered with the specific authority of a man who had the DoD equivalent of a master key. It was smaller than Conference Room B and smelled less of old coffee, and by 12:30 it contained Ruark, Vasquez, Delray, who had changed out of his tactical gear into civilian clothes that fit him the way tactical people's civilian clothes always fit, which was badly, and a woman named Lieutenant Ferris, who had come in on the same vehicle as Delray and had a broken left wrist in a field splint that she clearly intended no one to treat because she hadn't mentioned it once. Mara noticed it. She didn't say anything, not yet. The mission briefing took 40 minutes. She asked 23 questions, which she counted without intending to, and all 23 were answered with the directness that told her Ruark had prepared for her specifically, anticipating the gaps she'd identify, having the supporting information ready before she reached for it. It was the kind of preparation that said she was expected to say yes, which would have irritated her if she hadn't already made the decision in the stairwell when she heard the name. The patient, in all the briefing documents, consistently listed as Soldier 1, had been the senior medical officer on an operation that she had no clearance to know the full scope of. What she was cleared for was his medical status, his last known location within the operational area, the access route, and the equipment on site. Vitals as of 40 minutes ago, Delray said, pulling up the SAT relay transmission on his tablet. Pulse 84, BP 142 over 90. He's running high. Expected with ICP elevation, she said. It's the brain trying to compensate. She looked at the numbers. The Cushing's response hasn't kicked in yet, which means we're not at the crisis point, but the trajectory is wrong. If his pressure keeps climbing and the ICP keeps building, we'll see the triad within, she calculated, 12 hours, maybe less, depending on the underlying cause. Blunt trauma, Vasquez said. No penetrating injury. Hit a wall when the vehicle they were in took the blast. No LOC at impact, but he started showing symptoms 6 hours later. Epidural hematoma possible, she said, or subdural slow bleed without imaging, we won't know which. What's the treatment difference on your end? Rourke asked. The monitoring is the same. The management is the same. ICP reduction, positioning, osmotic therapy if I can get the mannitol. The difference matters surgically, and we don't have surgical capacity on site. She looked at him, which means my job is to keep him stable long enough to get him out, not to fix it. That's the job, he confirmed. She thought about what that meant in practical terms. Maintaining a patient on the edge of a neurological crisis, in a field environment, with limited monitoring, for however long the extraction took. She thought about the specific weight of that kind of vigil. The way time moved differently when you were measuring it in the increments of a person's failing compensation. She'd done it before. She didn't like remembering how it felt. Get me the hypertonic saline and the mannitol, she said. Everything else on Delray's list is workable, and someone needs to look at Ferris's wrist before we deploy. Ferris looked up from the map she'd been reviewing. It's fine. It's a fracture. Probably distal radius, maybe scaphoid involvement, based on how you're holding it. If it's scaphoid and it's not splinted properly, you'll lose grip strength in the field at the worst possible time. She met Ferris's eyes. I'll look at it now, or I'll look at it on the aircraft. Your choice. Ferris looked at Vasquez. Let her look at it, Vasquez said, without inflection, as if it were obvious. Ferris put her wrist on the table. While Mara was resplinting Ferris's wrist with materials she'd requisitioned from the supply room, which she had access to until her shift officially ended at 3, a fact she intended to use fully, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Judith Okafor, from HR. She answered. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, this is Judith Okafor. I'm calling to inform you that Dr. Ewan's complaint has been formally suspended pending the DOD review. The suspension action that was discussed this morning is not moving forward at this time. A pause. Mr. Price asked me to convey that the hospital administration is cooperating fully with the federal review process. I understand, Mara said. She was taping the splint. Ferris was watching the ceiling with the expression of someone determined not to show that it hurt. Thank you for letting me know. There's also, Ms. Sutton, I want to say personally, not in an official capacity. Okafor stopped, started again. I've worked in hospital administration for 18 years. I've sat in a lot of meetings. What happened in that room this morning it was not typical. Mara tied off the tape. No, she said. I imagine it wasn't. She ended the call. Ferris looked at her wrist, flexed her fingers carefully. Better, she said, with the specific reluctance of someone admitting a thing they didn't want to admit. Don't hyperextend it, Mara said. I mean it. If the scaphoid is involved and it displaces, you'll need surgery. You can't get where we're going. I'll be careful. Be more than careful. Be paranoid about it. She started cleaning up the tape and materials. Paranoid keeps hands functional. Delray, from across the table, said, She talks like this all the time now? Vasquez looked at him. She always talked like this. At 2:15, while Mara was at her locker retrieving the few personal items she kept there, a change of clothes, a small notebook she'd kept out of habit and almost never opened, a photograph she didn't look at directly, she heard her name and turned to find Jonas Merritt in the locker room doorway. He looked like he'd had a difficult morning, which he had. She waited. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started from a different place. "What I said in the meeting this morning, about the review process. You said what you thought was the safe answer. I said the wrong answer." He put his hands in the pockets of his white coat. "I knew it while I was saying it. I don't know if that makes it better or worse." She thought about it. "Worse," she said, "but not unforgivably so." He looked at the floor. "I've been an ER physician for 11 years. I've never seen anyone work a chest like that, not in a clean bay with full equipment." He paused. "What you did last night, I'm not going to forget watching that." She closed her locker. "Dr. Merritt, if there's a future review or a hearing and they ask you what you observed clinically, tell the truth. That's all I need from you." He nodded. It was the nod of a man making a private decision in real time and not entirely sure of himself yet, which was the most honest version of it. She left the locker room. At 2:49, 11 minutes before her shift officially ended, Adrienne Voss found her in the East Corridor. "Walk with me," Voss said. They walked. "The text you received this morning," Voss said, without preamble, keeping her voice below the ambient noise of the corridor. "The counterintelligence team has the number. It's a relay, layered, not traceable quickly, but the content is consistent with a pattern they've been tracking in connection with the operational security breach that put Sergeant Webb in that trauma bay." Mara looked straight ahead. "Someone knew I was going back in." "Someone in a position to know, which narrows it considerably." Voss glanced at her. "I want to be direct with you. The hospital situation, Ewan, the false HR notes, the reassignment, that's a separate track. My office handles the federal dimension, which is the operational security component. But the two tracks may intersect. How? Because if someone has been monitoring your location and your status for 6 months, and someone sent that text this morning, then the decision to embed you in this hospital, whether it was intentional management or not, may have been known to the wrong people from the beginning." Mara slowed. She stopped. She turned to look at Voss. "You're saying the leak may not be limited to the extraction." "I'm saying we're not certain it is." Voss met her gaze. "I'm telling you because you're going back in tonight and you deserve to know the full picture of what we know and don't know." "Does Ruark know?" "Yes, as of about 40 minutes ago. And he still wants me on the insertion. He says removing you increases the risk to Soldier One. He's probably right." Voss paused. "But I want you to go in with your eyes open." Mara looked at the corridor wall. Somewhere down the east wing, a monitor was alarming. The routine kind, the kind that meant a patient had rolled over and pulled a lead, not the kind that meant a crisis. A nurse was already moving to address it, the machinery of the hospital doing its ordinary work. "I'll go in with my eyes open," she said. Voss handed her a business card. Paper, which was unusual, with only a number on it. Anything changes, anything feels wrong in the field, that number reaches someone who can move assets in under 20 minutes. Mara took the card. She looked at it. She put it in her pocket. She left Harlow Peak Medical Center at 3:04. She did not announce her departure. She did not stop at the nursing station, or the supply room, or the administrative corridor. She walked through the main ER, past the supply cart she'd been pushing for 7 months, past the bay where she'd spent the last year and a half making herself small enough to fit into a hospital that had decided what she was before it knew who she was. Terrell Briggs was at the charge desk. He looked up when she passed. "Sutton," he said. She stopped. He looked at her for a moment, the particular look of a man who had watched something from a close distance and was still processing what he'd seen. "You coming back?" She thought about it. "I don't know yet." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. "For what it's worth," he said, "the supply room will be a mess without you." She almost smiled. "I know," she said. "Tell Donna goodbye for me." She walked out the ambulance bay doors into the gray afternoon. Tumkint. The staging point was 2 hours south by vehicle, a facility that didn't appear on commercial maps and whose entrance was marked only by a gate number and a keypad that Vasquez handled without explaining how he knew the code. The aircraft was already on the pad when they arrived, a configuration she recognized, rigged for medical insertion, with the specific interior layout of a vehicle that had been used for this purpose before. Delray was running final equipment checks when she climbed in. He looked up. Sutton. Delray. She looked at the medical kit. Where are the osmotic agents? Compartment 3, left side. Ruark came through about 40 minutes ago. He paused. Both of them. She opened the compartment. Mannitol 20%, 2 bags. Hypertonic saline 3%, 3. Enough. Barely, but enough. Head injury kit, she said. Bag 2. I put together what we had based on what I thought you'd want. If I miss something, I'll tell you. She pulled the bag and went through it. He'd done well. Not perfectly. Nobody stocked perfectly for an uncertain presentation, but well. She reorganized 2 items and left the rest. Vasquez climbed in last. He sat across from her, buckled in, and didn't say anything, which was one of the things she'd always valued about him. He understood the difference between the time for words and the time for quiet, and in the hour before an insertion, it was quiet. The aircraft lifted at 18:03. She sat with the kit on her knees and the business card from Voss in her breast pocket and the photograph she hadn't looked at directly in her jacket's inside pocket, and she watched the last light of the gray afternoon fall away as the aircraft climbed. She thought about Harlow Peak, about UN, who was somewhere in that building right now with a complaint suspended and an official inquiry building around her, and the specific bewilderment of a person who had always had the institutional weight on her side and was learning what it felt like when that shifted. She thought about Merritt, standing in the locker room doorway with his hands in his pockets and his conscience doing the slow work of arriving at a decision. She thought about Donna and Terrell, and the supply room with its reorganized shelves, and the suture kits that would be miscounted on Friday because no one else checked them at that hour. She thought about what Voss had said, the leak that might not be limited to the extraction, the text from the relay number, the 6 months of being watched, not only by UN, it turned out, but by people with a different agenda and a less obvious method of harm. She'd been used as a placeholder, managed and positioned, and the worst part, the part that sat in her chest with the specific weight of things that couldn't be argued away, was that the outcome, the mission tonight, Webb's survival, whatever came next, might be worth exactly what she'd paid to get here. She wasn't sure yet whether that made it better or worse. The aircraft banked south. Below, the landscape was dark enough that the details were gone, and it was only pattern. The scattered light of roads and towns, the long dark between them, the geography of a country going about its ordinary life without knowing what moved above it. She checked the kit one more time. She was halfway through the airway equipment when Delray's radio crackled. Not a scheduled check-in, not the routine frequency. And the voice that came through was Ruark from the staging point, and his voice had a quality she recognized before she understood the words. Sutton? Vasquez. We have a problem. A pause. The kind that meant he was choosing the order of information carefully. Voss's team traced the relay number from the text you received this morning. She set the kit down. The number originated from inside Harlow Peak Medical Center, Ruark said. From the administrative floor, they've narrowed the device to a specific office. Another pause. It's Jeffrey Price. The aircraft held its altitude and heading and speed. Vasquez was looking at her. She looked at the radio. There's more, Ruark said. Price made 3 calls in the 6 hours before Webb's extraction. 1 to a number connected to the same relay network. 1 to a private cell that the CI team is still running down. And 1 to the personal phone of Dr. Sandra Ewan. He stopped. They weren't just making your work life difficult, Sutton. They were reporting your status to someone with an interest in keeping you out of the field. The aircraft moved through the dark. She said very quietly, How long have they known about me? We don't know yet, Ruark said, but Price's access history on the hospital's HR system shows someone ran your full employment record on the same day you were hired. The day she was hired. She sat with that for a moment, the specific cold of it. Voss has them, she asked. Price is in federal custody as of 20 minutes ago. Ewan is being detained for questioning. We don't have the full picture yet, who they were reporting to, how high it goes, how long the network has been active. She looked at Vasquez. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had been in enough complicated situations to know when a person needed to locate their center before they could say anything useful. She found hers. "Keep us updated," she said to the radio. "We're 2 hours out. I need to focus on the medical situation." "Understood." Ruark paused. "Sutton, for what it's worth, they couldn't keep you out of the field. They tried for 7 months and they couldn't do it." She said nothing. She picked the kit back up. She kept checking equipment, item by item, her hands moving through the inventory in the dark of the aircraft, while the information settled into the rest of what she knew, and she understood now, fully, with the specific clarity that sometimes only came at altitude, that Harlow Peak had never been the quiet life she'd told herself it was. It had been a holding pattern, and someone had been working very hard to make sure she stayed in it. The aircraft crossed into the operational area at 1941, and the last 40 minutes of the flight were the kind that Mara remembered without wanting to. The specific interior silence of an aircraft carrying people toward something that couldn't be undone once it started. The way everyone in the cabin found their own version of stillness and stayed in it. Del Rey checked his kit twice. Vasquez didn't check anything, which was his version of the same thing. Ferris sat with her splinted wrist in her lap and her eyes closed, not sleeping. Nobody slept in the last 40 minutes, but doing whatever internal preparation she'd built for herself over 3 years of this work. Mara sat with the medical bag between her feet and ran the clinical picture in her head for the 14th time. Not because running it again would change anything, but because the repetition was its own form of control. Elevated ICP, possible epidural or subdural hematoma, mechanism consistent with blast-displaced blunt trauma. No imaging. Conscious and oriented at last check, which was 40 minutes old and therefore potentially inaccurate in a situation that could move fast. She knew what fast looked like. She'd watched it move once, years ago, in a man who'd seemed stable until he wasn't, and the 12 minutes between those two states had been the longest 12 minutes of her professional life. She was not going to let tonight have 12 minutes like those. The aircraft descended. The landing zone was a flat rock shelf in an elevated terrain that she couldn't map to anything specific, in darkness that was the deep, specific black of places with no ambient light for 50 miles in any direction. They came down hard, not a crash, but the firm contact of a pilot landing fast to minimize exposure time on the ground. And Del Rey had the door open before the rotors stopped cycling down. Cold air hit her. Altitude cold, dry, and immediate, the kind that went straight through fabric. A figure was waiting at the edge of the LZ, short, compact, moving toward them with the low profile of someone who'd been in this environment long enough to have internalized its rules. The figure resolved into a man as they got close, mid-30s, dark-bearded, with a specific kind of alert exhaustion that came from watching a deteriorating patient for hours without being able to do enough about it. Ferris, Del Rey. He looked at Vasquez, then at Mara. "I'm Sutton," she said. "I know." He extended a hand. "Medic Teague. I've been managing Soldier 1. He was already turning, already moving. He was stable 40 minutes ago. He vomited again about 20 minutes ago, and the headache is worse. He's keeping his eyes closed." She fell in beside him, bag over one shoulder. "Pupillary response? Equal and reactive last check 15 minutes ago, sluggish on the left." The sluggishness was new. She filed it with the weight it deserved. "Heart rate? 61 and dropping." The number tightened something in her chest. Bradycardia, rising blood pressure, altered respiratory pattern. The Cushing's triad was beginning to assert itself, which meant the intracranial pressure had crossed into the range where the brainstem was starting to feel it. "How far?" she said. 3 minutes. She didn't say anything else. She moved. The shelter was built into a rock overhang, not constructed exactly, but adapted, the way field positions always were, using what the environment offered and supplementing it with what people had carried in. There were 2 chem lights, low and red, a sleeping mat, a monitoring setup that was 3 steps above nothing and 2 steps below adequate. She saw him before her eyes fully adjusted. He was lying on his left side, Teague had positioned him correctly at least, head slightly elevated, airway clear. He was a large man, broad through the shoulder, and the size of him made the smallness of the position look wrong somehow, like something that had been reduced against its nature. She knew the face. She'd last seen it 3 years ago, in different circumstances, in a different country, when they were both different versions of themselves. Captain Nolan Reese, who had been her team's senior medical officer for 16 months, who had pulled her out of a ravine in the second year of her service, with a dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs, and had made exactly 2 jokes about it the entire time he was treating her, which was the right number. Who had requested her by name tonight, through Ruark, because he trusted her with his life, in the specific way that people trusted the people who had kept them alive before. She put the bag down. She put on gloves. She moved to his side and she said his name. He opened his eyes. They were too slow. The left pupil was what she'd feared, not blown, not fixed, but lagging in a way that had purpose, and that purpose was bad. "Sutton," he said. His voice was thick with the effort of it. "You're here." "I'm here." She was already doing the assessment, her hands working while she talked. "I need you to tell me your name and the date." "Nolan Reese, date is—" He stopped. "I don't have the date." "That's okay. What's the last date you remember?" He told her. It was off by 2 days. She noted it. She continued. "Pain level, 1 to 10. 11, he said. Then, with the ghost of something that might have been his regular personality pushing through the pressure. 9. I don't want to seem like I'm complaining. "You can complain," she said. "I'm not judging." She finished the neuro check. She turned to Teague. "How long since last vitals?" "I took them when I heard the aircraft. BP was 162/94. High and climbing." "Okay." She pulled the mannitol. "I'm starting osmotic therapy now. I need you to keep monitoring every 5 minutes. BP, heart rate, pupils. And tell me the moment anything changes. Anything." Teague moved into position. She ran the IV line and started the mannitol drip with the careful attention of someone doing a thing where the margin for error was the width of a clinical decision. Too fast, and the osmotic shift could cause problems of its own. Too slow, and the ICP kept building. She set the rate, checked the line, checked his arm, checked the clock. "This is going to make the headache worse before it gets better," she told Reese. "Outstanding," he said. "Just so you know." "I've had worse." "I know," she said. "I was there." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Sutton, the hospital. What they did to you, not now. I need to—" "Nolan." She said his name the specific way she'd learned to say things in the field. Flat, precise, carrying more weight than the words alone. "Right now you are my patient, and I need you to be quiet and let the medication work. We can talk about everything else when you're in a proper medical facility, and I can see your brain on an imaging screen. Deal?" A pause. "Deal." She watched the drip. She watched his face. She watched the clock. The first 40 minutes were the kind of time that expanded beyond their actual length, the way critical monitoring always did, each 5-minute interval feeling like it contained more than 5 minutes worth of possibility. Teague ran the vital checks with the efficient precision of someone who understood what they were looking for and knew the cost of missing it. Vasquez and Del Rey had set perimeter. Ferris was at the entrance of the overhang with her good hand on her radio and her splinted wrist held carefully at her side. At the 20-minute mark, Reese's blood pressure started to come down. Not dramatically, not in the way that things resolved cleanly in rooms with better equipment and better light, but down, 158/90, then 154. At 35 minutes, 147/88. She exhaled through her nose. "Headache?" she said. "Still there." He paused. "Less." "Less is good," she said. "Less is what we're working toward." She switched from mannitol to the hypertonic saline, slower infusion, sustained effect, and repositioned him slightly, and sat back on her heels in the red chem light and let herself, for the first time since she'd climbed into the aircraft, exist somewhere other than the acute management of the next 30 seconds. Her hands were in her lap. They were not shaking. They never shook. She'd thought once that eventually they would, that the accumulation of enough nights like this one would eventually find the part of her that was still built for ordinary life and break it. But that hadn't happened. What happened instead was stranger and less legible. She'd become two people who occupied the same body without conflict, the one who reorganized supply shelves and counted suture kits and drove home in the dark, and the one who was here, in the cold, keeping a man alive by the specific arithmetic of medication timing and vital sign interpretation and the institutional knowledge of 100 emergencies that had taught her exactly how much the body could take before it stopped tolerating being helped. She didn't know what to do with both of them. She hadn't known for 2.5 years. She thought maybe it was time to stop trying to resolve them into one. Well, the extraction window opened at 0100. By then, Reese's BP had stabilized at 139/82, his heart rate had climbed back to 70 and steadied, and his left pupillary response had improved from sluggish to what she was willing to call normal, with the caveat that normal in a rock shelter by ChemLight was a relative term and she would not fully exhale until she saw imaging results. She told him that, plainly. "You're better," she said. "You are not well. The difference matters." Understood. He was looking at her steadily now, the way he hadn't been able to for the first hour. "What's the extraction look like?" "Aircraft in 40 minutes. Surgical facility 45 minutes after that. Someone smarter than me will have imaging done within the hour of arrival." "And you'll be there?" She thought about that. "For the handoff, yes." "And after the handoff?" She didn't answer immediately. The chem light was fading at the edges, the way they did. Not dramatically, but progressively, the color flattening as the chemistry exhausted itself. In the remaining light, Reese looked like what he was, a person who had been through something serious and had made it to the other side of the immediate danger and was now in the specific territory of survival where the next question was what came after. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still working it out." He accepted that. He'd always known when to accept things from her and when to push, which was another thing she'd forgotten she valued until she was back in a position to remember it. The aircraft came in at 00:58, 2 minutes early, and Vasquez called it clean from the perimeter, so they were moving within 30 seconds of landing. Loading Reese was not the smooth evolution it would have been with a full medical team. It was the actual version of moving a large, partially incapacitated man across rocky ground in darkness while maintaining IV line integrity and monitoring continuity, which required 3 people in a specific sequence of coordination that Mara directed the way she directed things in the field, which was through precise instruction and the willingness to physically demonstrate when words weren't faster. They got him loaded. She climbed in last, settled the monitoring beside her, and the aircraft lifted before she'd finished checking the line. 41 minutes later, they put down at a facility with power and lights, and a trauma team that came to meet them with the organized energy of people who had been pre-briefed and were ready. She gave the handoff report in the bay doorway, concise, sequential, nothing left out and nothing added that hadn't been observed. And when she finished, the receiving physician, a woman with the composed authority of genuine competence, looked at the vitals log Teague had kept and then looked at Mara. "You manage this in field conditions?" she said. "Limited monitoring and osmotic agents," Mara said. "That's all we had." The physician looked at the log again. "This is good work." Mara looked at Reese on the gurney, being moved toward imaging, his eyes open now and tracking the ceiling with the dull attentiveness of someone who was still inside the headache but no longer drowning in it. He turned his head as they moved him. He found her face. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She watched the doors close behind the gurney. Then she sat down on a bench in the facility corridor, and she put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and she stayed like that for about 90 seconds, which was what she allowed herself. Then she straightened up and went to find coffee. The imaging came back at 0340, a small epidural hematoma, right temporal, not expanding. The neurosurgeon on call reviewed it with the cautious optimism of someone who had seen worse go badly and was therefore unwilling to declare anything resolved before it was resolved, but her language was, in the clinical sense, positive. Conservative management, close monitoring, no surgical intervention indicated at this time. Reese was awake and alert when Mara looked in on him at 04:15. The headache was a 4, he said, which meant it was probably a 6, and he was calibrating downward out of something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it. 4, she repeated. Maybe 5. Nolan. 6, he said. It's a 6, but a manageable 6. She sat in the chair beside his bed. The room was small. All the rooms in facilities like this were small, and the light was the fluorescent kind that made everyone look approximately unwell. He looked better than he had 4 hours ago, which was the only comparison that mattered. I heard about what they did to you at the hospital, he said. Ruark briefed me 3 weeks ago when the CI picture started coming together. 3 weeks ago, she said. He was building a case. He needed the pattern to be complete before he moved. He looked at the ceiling. I was angry about it. If I'd had a way to... It's done, she said. It wasn't dismissal. It was the specific finality of someone who had processed the thing and was ready to move past it. Price is in custody. UN is being questioned. Whatever they were feeding to whoever they were feeding it to, that pipeline is gone. Do you know who they were reporting to? Voss will have more by morning. She looked at her hands. The full investigation will take time. These things always do. Are you angry? She considered it honestly. Yes, she said. I'm angry that 7 months of my life were managed by people who understood what I was worth and used that understanding against me. I'm angry at the waste of it. She paused. I've been thinking since the aircraft that there's something in what happened that I needed to understand about myself. He waited. I let them contain me, she said. UN and Price. They didn't have to work that hard. I'd already done half their job for them. I came to that hospital wanting to be invisible. I wanted to put everything I was into a box and close the lid and be ordinary. She looked at him. And the thing I've been sitting with is, I don't think that was possible. Not because I'm exceptional, but because you can't actually do that. You can't put down who you are and just walk away from it and have the walking away be clean and finished. It follows you. It shows in the supply room at 3 in the morning when you restock a trauma cart before anyone else understands what's coming. He was quiet for a moment. Is that why you came back? I came back because 2 people needed medical help, and I was the person with the training to provide it. That's true, he said. It's also not the whole answer. She looked at the floor. No, she said. It's not. She slept 4 hours on a cot in a room off the main corridor. She'd slept in worse places, on shorter notice, and she was out within minutes of lying down. Not the troubled half-sleep of someone processing, but the deep structural sleep of a body that had spent everything it had and was calling in the debt. She woke at 0900 to a message from Voss. It was brief. Voss's messages were always brief, which Mara was coming to understand was the woman's fundamental courtesy. She didn't make people read 3 paragraphs to find the information they needed. Price cooperating. Network traced to private contractor with DoD access. Under investigation. Ewan, separate track but aware of Price's activities. Criminal referral being prepared for both. Hospital administration has been formally notified of federal findings. Director Calloway contacted my office at 0730 requesting a meeting. Will update. Mara read it twice. Then she set the phone down and lay on the cot staring at the ceiling for a while, not thinking precisely, just letting the information be what it was. Jeffrey Price, who had told her with practiced blandness that her role had been adjusted. Sandra Ewan, who had closed a supply corridor door and told her that the child's outcome was irrelevant to the principle of her authority. 2 people who had built their institutional lives on the management of what other people were allowed to be, and who had apparently extended that management into territory that the law took a different view of than they'd anticipated. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel about it. She'd thought, in the abstract, that there would be something clean about this moment, some satisfaction with sharp edges and a clear shape. What she actually felt was more complicated, a tired vindication, the specific weight of being right about something that had cost real time to be right about, and underneath it, quieter, the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. It felt like her own territory, like ground she was allowed to stand on. She got up and went to check on her patients. Webb was in a recovery room 2 doors down from Reese, and she found him awake and sitting up at 09:30, which was more progress than she'd expected for a man who had been 4 minutes from death 31 hours ago. He looked at her when she came in. He had the particular look of a person who had been briefed on something while they were recovering and was still fitting it into their understanding of events. "You're the one who put the chest tube in," he said. "Yes." "The attending couldn't do it?" "He would have," she said. "Eventually." Webb looked at her with an expression that understood exactly what eventually meant in that context. "I'm told you're Phantom. That name is retired. People keep saying that about you." He shifted. His color was good. Better than good, actually, which was either excellent surgical work from Ostrander or the specific resilience of someone who had been keeping themselves in the kind of physical condition that helped bodies recover from violence. Probably both. "Delray says you resplinted Ferris's wrist mid-brief. It was fractured. She was going to lose grip strength. He also says you went through the kit list on the aircraft in about 4 minutes and reorganized 2 items. They were in the wrong order for the likely sequence of interventions." Webb was quiet for a moment, then, "I want to say something, and I want to say it directly, because I don't know how to say it any other way." She waited. "I've been in this work for 14 years, he said. "I've had a lot of people keep me alive in a lot of situations. Good medics, trained people, people who knew what they were doing." He stopped. "What you did in that bay, the speed of it, the certainty, that's not just training. That's a level of capability that the military spent years building in you, and the hospital spent 7 months trying to bury." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "And I think you should know that what was done to you was wrong, not just procedurally, fundamentally, and the people who did it are going to answer for it." She looked at him. She had an answer prepared, the careful, deflecting version she'd been using for 2.5 years, the one that managed gratitude by redirecting it toward the team or the training or the circumstances. She opened her mouth to deploy it. She closed her mouth. "Thank you," she said instead. Just that. No deflection, no redirection. He nodded. That was enough. She called Voss at 10:15 from the facility's communications room. "The director of Harlow Peak," she said. "Calloway." "What did he want?" "He's requesting a meeting to discuss the findings and to, I'm quoting his office, address the institutional failures that led to this situation." Voss paused. "He specifically asked about your status and whether you intended to return." Mara leaned against the wall. Through the window, the terrain outside was morning lit now. The same rock and dry elevation that had been featureless dark 10 hours ago. And in the daylight, it looked like what it was, which was a hard place that didn't particularly care whether you were there or not. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was your decision to make, and that my office's concern was the federal dimension, not the employment relationship." "Right answer." "I've been doing this a while." Another pause. "For what it's worth, the findings that are going to come out of this investigation will make your file at Harlow Peak look like what it is, a fabrication. Whatever comes next for you, professionally, that record won't follow you." "I know." "Do you know what comes next?" She looked at the terrain. She thought about the supply cart. She thought about the trauma bay at 2:47 in the morning and the specific feeling of moving through it as a person who finally had nothing to conceal. She thought about Reese, down the corridor with his six that was probably more headache and his small epidural hematoma and his face in the red chem light saying her name with the specific relief of someone who had needed her and found her. She thought about Donna handing her a cup of coffee. Terrell asking if she was coming back. Merritt in the locker room, making the slow, private decision to be better than he'd been. She thought about what it meant to be needed by a hospital and needed by the field, and to have spent 2.5 years trying to choose between them as if they were mutually exclusive. "Not entirely," she said, "but more than I did yesterday." Sick. She flew back on a different aircraft, a smaller one, and arrived at Harlow Peak Medical Center at 14:20 on a Friday afternoon, 36 hours after she'd walked out the ambulance bay doors in her own clothes with her badge still in her pocket. The badge still worked. She didn't know if that was oversight or intention, and she didn't particularly care. She clipped it on. The ER was mid-afternoon busy, the particular energy of a hospital on a Friday, when the week's accumulated decisions about whether to seek care had resolved into action, and the waiting room was full, and the charge desk had the look of controlled urgency. She walked through it, and nobody stopped her, because nobody stopped someone in scrubs with a badge who moved like they knew where they were going. She was going to the director's office. Calloway was a man in his early 60s who had the look of someone who had spent a career managing institutions and understood, with the wisdom of accumulated difficult situations, when an institution had failed and when the correct response was to say so plainly. He stood up when she came in, which she noted. "Ms. Sutton," he gestured to the chairs. "Thank you for coming." She sat. "I'm told you wanted to discuss the findings." "I did." He sat across from her. He had a folder, different from Ewan's folder, this one not deployed as an instrument but set to one side, like reference material rather than ammunition. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing everything, the HR files, the inventory logs, Dr. Ewan's complaint history, the DOD review of last Tuesday night." He paused. "And I want to say directly that what happened to you at this hospital was an institutional failure at multiple levels. The reassignment was not legitimate. The HR notes were fabricated. And the complaint filed against you after you saved Sergeant Webb's life was, retaliatory is the word that the Federal Review uses, and I think it's accurate." She said nothing. She let him say the things that needed to be said without helping him say them. "I also want to say," he continued, "that I am aware I bear responsibility for the environment that made this possible. I knew Ewan ran a tight department. I didn't know the specific nature of what she was doing. That's not an excuse. It's an acknowledgement that attention I should have been paying wasn't being paid." He looked at her directly. "I am sorry for what happened to you here." The apology landed differently than she'd expected. Not hollow. It had the weight of a man who had actually looked at the thing and come to terms with its shape. But not entirely sufficient either, because sufficient wasn't the standard. The standard was honesty, and this met it. "I know," she said. "What happens to Ewan?" "She's been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal inquiry and a separate hospital board review. Her clinical privileges have been suspended. Based on what the board has seen so far, reinstatement is unlikely." "And Merritt?" Calloway's expression shifted slightly. "Dr. Merritt came to my office yesterday morning, before I'd had a chance to reach out to him. He submitted a written statement about what he observed clinically on Tuesday night and a separate written acknowledgement about the statements he made in the meeting that morning." He paused. "He asked me to convey, through whatever channel was appropriate, that he intends to tell the truth in any formal proceeding." She absorbed that. Merritt had moved further than she'd expected him to, maybe faster than he'd expected himself to. "What are you offering?" she said. "Because the meeting had a purpose, and it was better to get to it directly." "Your original clinical nursing position," Calloway said, "in the ER, not supply, with immediate reinstatement of full clinical privileges, and a formal review of your file to ensure that the fabricated HR notes are removed and documented as fabrications." She looked at the folder on the side of his desk. "That's the minimum." "Yes," he agreed. "It is. What else?" He reached into the folder. He slid a document across to her. Not a form, an offer letter. She looked at it. It was a position she hadn't applied for. Clinical trauma-led, emergency department. The salary line made the supply position look like a different career in a different country. "It's a new role," he said. "It didn't exist before this week. I created it because we need it, and because the last 36 hours have made it very clear that we have been operating with a significant gap in our trauma competency." He paused. "I want to fill that gap with the person who's actually most qualified to fill it, which is you." She sat with the document for a moment. She thought about the photograph in her jacket pocket. She'd looked at it for the first time in 8 months, on the aircraft back, in the daylight coming through the window. It was a photograph she'd taken on her last deployment, a medical bay that was more a tent than a room, full of equipment she'd organized and maintained, with people she'd worked alongside who were also flawed and also tired and also doing the most important work of their lives. She'd kept it because she hadn't been able to throw it away, and she'd avoided looking at it because she hadn't been ready for what it made her feel, which was that she missed it. Not the danger, not the cost, the work, the absolute unambiguous importance of the work, the way it stripped everything non-essential and left only what mattered. She felt that here. Not always, not in the supply corridor, not in the meetings with Price, but in the trauma bay at 2:47 in the morning, she had felt it completely. She picked up the offer letter. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." Donna gets a formal recognition, 31 years of competent nursing work, and I watched her make the right call in 30 seconds on a morning when everybody else was still processing. She doesn't get paid what she's worth, but she should at least know the institution sees her. Calloway wrote something. Done. Terrell Briggs ran a solid overnight with no notice and imperfect information. Whatever the charge nurse advancement track looks like, he should be on it. Also done. And the inventory system in the supply room needs a structural overhaul. The mislabeled delivery I caught in October wasn't a one-time occurrence. I have 14 months of notes on recurring supply chain errors that could have caused patient harm. She set the letter down. I'll write up the full analysis, but fixing it needs to be a hospital priority, not a supply staff problem. He looked at her steadily. You've been keeping notes for 14 months on supply chain safety issues. From the first week, she said, because someone should have been and no one was. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the expression of a man who had just understood something he'd missed, is that why you stayed? When you could have left? She looked at the offer letter. Partly, she said. Partly I stayed because I hadn't finished becoming who I was going to be yet, and I needed the time, even if it came the wrong way. He put his pen down. Ms. Sutton, Mara, I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. All right? Do you want to be here? Not because we're offering more now, not because of what Voss's office has done to the people who made this difficult, but because this is where you want to do the work. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was the flat winter kind that didn't flatter anything, but showed it accurately. She thought about a rock shelf in the dark, and a dying man's blood pressure coming down point by point. She thought about Delray's hands, and Teague's vital log, and Ferris's careful wrist. She thought about Reese saying her name with the specific weight of relief and trust combined, and she thought about Donna with 2 cups of coffee at 6 in the morning, and the child in the hallway at Harlow Peak who'd cried for too long, and the 6-year-old with the pool water in his lungs whose outcome had been better for 30 seconds of attention. She thought about the fact that she had 2 versions of herself and had spent 2.5 years trying to make one of them disappear, and that both of them were in this room right now, and that maybe the answer was not resolution but accommodation, learning to carry both of them without treating one as the enemy of the other. Yes, she said, I want to be here. She signed the offer letter. 3 weeks later, Nolan Reese was cleared for discharge from the surgical facility. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon when she was finishing a shift, her 3rd week as clinical trauma lead, which was a position that required more administrative work than she'd anticipated and more interpersonal navigation than she'd enjoyed, and which also, twice in those 3 weeks, had put her in a trauma bay doing exactly what she was built to do. Imaging was clean, he said. They're calling it resolved. I know, she said. Voss told me. You've been talking to Voss? She updates me on the investigation. She leaned against the wall outside the locker room. The corridor smelled like disinfectant and the end of a long shift. Price entered a cooperation agreement. The network they were feeding information to is the subject of a grand jury proceeding. It'll take a year, maybe longer. And Ewan? Hospital board pulled her privileges permanently. The state medical board has an open file. Her attorney is talking about civil cooperation in exchange for the federal charges being narrowed. She paused. It won't be fast. These things aren't. But it's moving. It's moving. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had, the one she remembered, where the silence was doing something useful. I heard you signed on permanently. Clinical trauma lead. That's not a small job. No, she said. It's not. Are you... Does it feel right? She thought about 3 weeks of difficult meetings and one supply chain analysis that had taken 12 hours and 2 trauma bays where she'd stopped everything from going wrong. She thought about a morning last week when a resident had made a mistake in a critical moment and she'd corrected it the way she'd learned to correct things in the field, directly, without cruelty, without pausing to manage anyone's feelings about being corrected. The resident had come to her office the next day, not to complain, to ask her to teach him. "It's getting there," she said. "It's not clean, but it's getting there." "Good," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, not the reflexive kind, the real kind, the kind that knew what it was responding to. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her phone in her hand, not thinking about anything specific, just occupying the space and the hour and the particular kind of quiet that comes at the end of a shift that has cost something real and produced something that mattered. Donna walked by with a clipboard. She stopped. "Good shift," she said. "Yeah," Mara said. "Not bad." Donna continued on. The corridor resumed its ordinary rhythm. Mara clipped her badge to her scrubs, the Harlow Peak badge, with the new title, which she hadn't quite gotten used to seeing, and she walked back toward the trauma bay. Not the supply cart, not the corridor at the edge of everything, the trauma bay, because that was where the work was, and she was done standing at the edge of it.